Part 4. Basic Principles. Indian Time. This is going to be a tough one for some of you. It's going to involve a bit more letting go than you may be used to, and the reference here applies to all things, not just time. You will need to learn to allow things to simply happen. Remember, this is a complex universe, even the small part of the world around you. We have a tremendous propensity and desire to control events and circumstances, often to our own detriment. If you are a, quote, control freak, unquote, you will have great difficulty here. Events will tend not to be fixed, timing will be much more fluid than you will be accustomed to, and circumstances, participants, and events will alter to suit the occasion without warning. You must allow these things to happen. Often we fix ourselves into a pattern of expectation. This is not the way of the world. Although the flow of life can generally be expectatious, anything can happen at any time. Attempting to overexert control or intensely influence events that have a life of their own will only snap back at you. Now, this does not mean that you should become complacent or a victim. It simply means that we must recognize that the world is larger than ourselves. Make your plans, recruit the participants, schedule your events, and create your routines. Just remember that once something is set in motion, it becomes its own force and develops its own will. Allow it to happen. Let go. Put yourself on Indian time. The principle of duality. In a public television program called The Creation of the Universe, it was said that prior to the Big Bang, existence was described as, quote, perfect symmetry, unquote. Everything in balance, everything perfect and without flaw or recognizable difference. In other words, no thing was any different than any other thing, to the point where there was no such thing as a thing. Light could not be distinguished from dark, nor up from down, nor here from there. The Christians say, "And God said, let there be light, and there was light." The television program described it similarly by saying that there was this perfect condition of, quote, nothing somethingness, unquote, an inconceivable perfection of balance to the point of being indistinguishable, perfect symmetry. Suddenly, without the cause to be known, there was a something, a flaw in the perfection. At that point there was a here and a there. There was a not here and a not there. Out of the flawless perfection came the first concept of the universe, the concept of duality. The concept of duality permeates our first American spirituality. My aforementioned description was echoed by a Lakota spiritual leader whom I have come to respect a great deal. He was delighted to hear that the white world was finally beginning to see the structure of creation similar to the way his people had been taught for hundreds of generations. Generally, without recognizing it for what it is, one of the key elements we must learn to recognize and respect is the parallel of the physical and the spiritual. Many of us recognize and acknowledge only the physical. We're skeptical, or we cling to what we perceive as physical representations of things spiritual. We need proof. Trouble is, we seek proof of the spiritual in a physical form. That's like proving the existence of a cow to someone who has never seen one by drawing a picture of it. It simply isn't proof and never could be. The first step you must take along this road is to fully recognize the, quote, dualic, unquote, nature of creation, by knowing that the first division is between that of the physical and the spiritual. Believing simply isn't enough. You must know that it is the way of the world. You can only reach that point in your thinking in your own time and in your own way. Free will and destiny. One very basic concept I have come to understand as I have walked this way is the companion nature of free will and destiny. Keep in mind that I see destiny as separate from fate. I see fate as the inevitable after we have applied our own will to the path God has set us on. I see the concepts of free will and destiny as two of the major forces that walk side by side in our daily lives. They help us to shape our future and write our past. They are unavoidable elements that have equal weight in every moment of our existence. Every moment of every day we make decisions about our lives, where we are going, what we are doing, and how we intend to get there. And every moment of every day comes and goes as time rolls on. We are living with our past choices and submitting to those things with which we have no choice. This is why I feel I must choose wisely. Once history is written, it is done. It cannot be undone. It can be atoned to, it can be learned from, and it can be corrected, but it cannot be changed. This is also why I have learned to accept those things in my life that I have never been intended to change or had no power to change. I once heard the phrase, "I live in a world I didn't create." It comforts me to know this. My small mind, my tiny spirit, cannot take on the responsibility of the universe. I can only learn from and become fulfilled by it. I have accepted what I cannot avoid seeing. Life is a test. It is a challenge to find our way home. We have a destiny, and it is up to us to shape our fate with our free will. Spirit in all things. Another key element in Lakota philosophy, and for other First Americans, is the concept that the Spirit of God, or Tunkashala or Wankantanka, I will explain my perspective of the difference later, is in all things. Look at it this way. In Christian words, it is said, "And God created the heavens and the earth." Wouldn't that mean that in creating all things there was an element of God in all things? When an artist creates a painting or a sculpture, isn't he or she putting themselves into their work? This is another key element in Lakota spirituality too. Every day and in all ceremony they remind themselves that God is here with them in all they see, hear, and touch. With regularity in their own language, they repeat the phrase, "all my relations." Because God has created all things and is therefore within all things are related. To forget or ignore this is a recipe for disaster. If you choose to explore your way down the Lakota road of spirituality, you will use this phrase often. In Lakota, the words are pronounced Medakwiye Yoyasen. A shorter version is also used, which is pronounced Medakwiase. By maintaining this perspective, it is possible to keep a high level of respect for the elements of the world we live in. This respect extends to everything from plants, animals, and rivers and rocks, to the fork you eat with, to the socks on your feet, to the moon in the sky, to the lowest creepy crawly slug. Sound a little silly? Just think on it. All things are here because God put them here, regardless of how man might have altered them, and we must respect that creation. Why? Because you are a part of that creation. Just like the stone or a tree or a cloud, God has broken off a piece of himself and given it a life of its own. God is in all things, and you are a part of God. The Sacred Circle. Quite often, if you are exposing yourself to traditional First American philosophy, you will hear a lot about the sacred circle or hoop. This is the expanded perception of the concept of all my relations, the view that all things are connected and relate to one another in a dynamic sense. In Western thinking, everything has a beginning and an end. You start out at point A and you go to point B, and the guy that gets there in the straightest line, we are told, wins the race. We seem to think we're in some kind of competition to see who's the best or strongest or smartest or richest, and we use the start and finish line as a basis for living. A Christian's world began with the birth of Christ and will abruptly end with his violent judgmental return. Our education starts with kindergarten and ends with graduation. We begin our careers after school and end at our retirement. or we begin a marriage at the altar and it ends in divorce or at death. This can be called linear thinking. An example of how this way of thinking can have adverse effects was an experiment in hypnosis I saw a few years ago in a documentary on human behavior. It illustrated how disconnecting an individual from the flow of life adversely affects behavior. Psychologists were playing around with the concepts of past, present, and future and how they affected our overall attitude and mood. Under hypnotic suggestion, the idea of having either a past, present, or future was alternately removed from a number of subjects' thinking. As I recall, the subjects were generally considered to be balanced, happy, and in reasonable mental health to begin with. When a person's past was clouded or even erased from them, they became lost and disillusioned, without a connection or concept as to who they were. Conversely, if their future was removed, they became flippant, uncaring, even bitter about themselves and the way they perceived things. What happened was that these suggestions cut an individual off from the flow of life and an imbalance was created. Instead of having a sense of belonging and purpose and an idea where they've been and where they fit, their travel through the cycle of life was cut off. In other words, a beginning or an end was created and life became contained, separated, and set apart. Their purpose became, quote, linear, unquote, and they were lost. In Lakota thinking, and indeed general First American thought, all things in the universe are not based in a straight line from here to there, or contained, but are a part of a continuous broken circle and rhythm. Everything is a component of a cycle. Everything has a place on the circle. You cannot assign a beginning or an end or a priority to any one part. This blends all of the things in the world together, illustrates them as one, and gives all things a vital purpose in maintaining life. An important point to be made here is that if one part of the circle becomes weak, an imbalance is created and the whole structure is threatened. It's up to all of us to see that our part remains strong. When we are strong, we must share our strength with the weaker parts. The concept of sharing this strength is equally important since too much strength in any one area can cause just as serious an imbalance. You may now begin to see that the combination of all the factors of living, such as spirit, physical life, the existence of profound duality, dynamic interplay, and the sacred quest for learning, blend together as a whole. The Red Road and Balance. As you may have been able to observe, the idea of balance is an important element in this way of thinking. In our First Americans' philosophy, this principle is considered sacred and is often referred to as, quote, the Red Road, unquote. In order for you to walk the Red Road, you must maintain a balance with all of the things you encounter in your life. This literally covers everything that you can think of. You must walk along the center of the road between all of the extremes, excesses, and compulsions you experience. For us foolish humans, particularly us Europeans, this can be quite an effort. How often do we get a few extra bucks in our pockets and find ourselves blowing it on a spending spree only to regret the waste later? In a more serious extreme, what about our high level of chemical dependence and our alcoholism? Remember that the American Indian alcoholic is a product of our effort and influence. And how many sit with a bag of chips and realize half an hour later that they finished the whole bag? How many of us sit at our jobs 5 days a week, bored to tears or just plain sick of it, and explode on the weekend with all kinds of furious activities? Of course, the opposite can be true too. We scurry around feverishly all week on the job and then veg out on the weekend. To me, life is tough enough without tossing all that crap into it too. In nature, outside the influence of mankind, you will always find things in their closest balance. An imbalance or extremes in nature can be disastrous to the whole system. Introduce a new mass into a solar system like a planetoid or comet, and all orbits are threatened and the planetary bodies are in jeopardy. Introduce a new species into a functioning ecosystem, and many other species are threatened with extinction. Burn out one tiny resistor in your VCR, and no movie tonight. Throw a small stone in the oil pan of an engine and the whole mechanism can be destroyed. Yes, mechanical and electronic devices can have a quote-unquote natural balance too. The Lakota and other tribes had woven their concern for balance in their world into the fabric of their daily lives, their language, and their religion. They constantly reminded themselves that they are intimately connected to the life-giving cycles of the natural world, the brotherhood of mankind, and the unseen spirit world of powers beyond human comprehension. The Sacred Earth Mother. Let's get one thing straight right now. Our first Americans are not a bunch of, quote, tree huggers, unquote, and environmental wackos or vegetarians. I know some of you will take offense at my perspective, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that our first Americans were realists and exploited their environment in order to survive. This included clearing away trees to plant, killing off herds of animals, and eating meat. They even fought with their neighbors for domination over territory. The difference between them and Western culture is one of respect. Like Jews with kosher, what they took with an eye on the future and their children, and they respected their ancestors since they had shown them this sacred way. They respected their quote-unquote relatives, the animals they ate, the trees they cut down for farming, yes, some did farming, and the minerals they extracted or chose not to extract from the ground. Their spirituality taught them that there was a price to be paid for abuse or misuse, and as we are discovering today, they were right. We as a race throughout the world have greatly ignored the environment that sustains us. We have claimed it for our own selfish purposes, believing it is there for us to exploit as we see fit. We have forgotten ourselves. On the other side, I will provide an example as to how silly we can be when we become deeply concerned about what is wrong with our current perspective and go too far the other way. After attending a sacred sweat lodge, it is traditional to feast or at least share food with one another. In my early years, the quote-unquote teachers that ran these lodges would attract all sorts of people. Most were quite nice and easygoing. Many had difficulties in their lives and were greatly troubled. One type of person that was attracted to these events was vegetarians, feeling that our first Americans would relate to their perspective. This is partially true, and the subject was always an interesting topic of discussion. After one lodge, the food was laid out on a table and a bowl appeared. It looked like chili. It was vegetarian chili. It was all my brother and I could do to maintain our composure. How can you call something chili without meat? What made the situation sad rather than humorous was the fact that the person that had prepared the dish, who had attended these events regularly, was quite serious about the spiritual value of the lack of meat, thinking that our first Americans dare not kill an animal. This perspective was simply incorrect. No one said anything or embarrassed this person, but I did run into him at a ceremony a couple of years later and caught him gnawing on a chicken bone. We chatted about his quote-unquote transformation, and he explained that an elder had taught him about respect for all living things. In effect, even if we are vegetarians, we still kill to eat. The Creator placed us on this earth as omnivores, consumers of both plant and animal substances. My friend had come to accept that fact and the basis of respect. These substances and their source, plants and animals, are the nurturing elements of the Earth Mother, and we are obligated to respect them. What we are, physically, everything about us, from our origins as a species to our individual bodies, is a result of the life-giving power of our Mother the Earth. This includes the complex processes that have allowed us to become what we are. Ignoring the true nature of these processes is simply wrong. I consider anyone who discounts this, disregards this, or fails to recognize the critical nature and effect of this to be a complete idiot or, at the very least, an arrogant fool. In another perspective, many would say that we live on a simple, lifeless rock that exists merely for our pleasure and enrichment by some perverse exploitative process without regard to consequence. These people must be stopped. There are nothing but consequences. Fortunately, the educational process of making people aware of this simple fact is slowly taking effect. I believe that everyone from birth has an innate sense of the life-giving force of the Earth Mother. It is quote-unquote culture that either enhances this sense or represses it. The road of our first Americans is one of enhancement. The descendants of the Europeans who, quote-unquote, settled here are still learning. The ancient cycles of the Earth's life-giving power are too important to ignore, and they can be unforgiving. Remember, too, that the Earth we live on is also a life force. What makes her a life-giving force to us is the fact that she possesses a life of her own, and one much older and more sophisticated than ours. The Lakota call her Maka, and as her physical forces are powerful, so too is her spirit. In sacred ceremony, she is one of the first spirits deserving of prayer, and you will hear her name often. I've come to enjoy this knowledge of Maka. It gives me a sense of security knowing her life-giving force is so ancient, knowledgeable, and so caring. She is the essence of nurturing and revels in the role of one of the principal creators of life and beauty. Not one original thought. If you can accept the fact that this is a universe of God's creation, you must take your thoughts one step further. You must recognize the fact that you, as a life force, have been separated from that creation and made ignorant. This is a gift. Your personal quest for knowledge, understanding, and purpose is a sacred one. No one can really say what the consequences are to ignoring or denying this. It has caused billions of conversations throughout hundreds of centuries with no resolution. I believe that the conquest of our ignorance is the key to the adventure of life. God possesses the knowledge of the universe, and He has challenged us to find our way back to Him and enlightenment. Since God is all truth and knowledge, I believe that there is nothing we can think, say, do, invent, or discover that is not already of Him, not one original thought. What is critical is, first, whether or not we choose to seek, and second, how we go about it. In my mind, it can be said that God is with us one by one. We have the capacity to commune with Him moment by moment. He will guide us if we ask. If we choose not to ask or ignore His guidance or deny, quote, the truth and the light, unquote, we will lose our way. Just remember that there is no way to support any perspective of the arrogance that we know better. God is the creator of all things, and is in all things, and by that it is we that must go to Him. The sacredness of modern technology. If you in any way accept the aforementioned discussion, you must take your thinking one step further. For some of you with heartfelt convictions of, quote, the ills of society, unquote, it may not be an easy step. For the moment, accept that God is in all things, whether it is all part of some great plan or whether He simply created it all and set it afloat to find its own way. The Creator, the great mystery, is the origin of the universe and possesses all knowledge from the beginning to the end in full circle. By that fact, we are simply not capable of having a single original thought. If this is so, how can the technology we have quote-unquote discovered and learned to use be an essentially evil thing, as many naysayers of the modern age would have us believe? Quite simply, it cannot. All things are of the Great Spirit, and the Great Spirit is within all things. How we use it, however, can be evil, or simply wrong. The fact that we are capable of converting fossil fuel into useful, life-enhancing energy is not in itself a bad thing. The fact that we use the power of that process to dominate and control humanity and foul the environment that sustains us is. The fact that we can extract metals from the ground and form them into a myriad of tools is not an essentially bad thing either. The fact that we use some of those tools to control, kill, and torture each other is. Technology is its own force in the universe. We are merely the instruments of its manifestation. Look at it this way. We are the children of the Earth Mother. She is a living, evolving life force in the universe. It has come time for her to reach beyond herself and seek out her brethren. She can only accomplish this through the actions of her offspring. She has reached a point at which she wishes her children to grow beyond her personal nurturing and learn the ways of survival on their own. She wishes us to grow up and learn to take her life force out into the universe. Without the ability to manipulate the resources that sustain us, we can never strike out on our own, so she has paved the way for us to learn. Our acquisition of technological knowledge is an integral part of the growth of our Mother the Earth, and it is by this process that our use of technology becomes sacred. It has not become known to us to make us warm and cozy in large homes with creature comforts and entertaining toys for our own vain and selfish amusement. We haven't developed automobiles exclusively to take us to the mall so we can lavish ourselves in more self-indulgent accoutrements. These are the objectives of a self-serving, self-destructive, and childish people. Ours is a sacred quest. I believe that the only reason we've emerged from the muck and the ooze and evolved with the ability to manipulate technology is to assist the Earth Mother in her own evolution in reaching out to the other entities in the Creator's world. By this we must learn to respect what we know and why we have it, how we must use it to enhance all the life forces of the earth and move beyond her boundaries with her message and her goodwill. If you haven't figured it out by this point, you should know that I consider our various space programs to be sacred journeys. We've been entrusted with the knowledge to break the physical boundaries of our home, the Earth. It is, to me, an undeniably sacred task that encompasses the representation of all Earth's life forces to the far reaches of space. This is one of the elements of my discussion that many will not see as relating to Native American issues. With some examination, you may find that it is at the core. Natural order as natural law. The way we've come to conduct ourselves in everyday life in contemporary society has become a reflection of our unwillingness to accept the universe as it was created. An example of this is some cultures' compulsive need for gardening. Yes, I said gardening. Not the grow a few vegetables in summer type of gardening, but the kind that completely reinvents a particular environment. It is the propensity to exercise the ultimate control over one's environment, the quintessential control device. Strip a patch of land bare and replace all life within it with one's own perception of balance. This presents a dichotomy of two opposing perspectives. Each represents two equally valid principles living side by side. The first is that life has evolved on its own, by the hand of the Creator, and has a balance that is worthy of respect. The other is that man has the ability to observe the workings of nature, the capacity to reason through it, and manipulate it to his own end. Neither is wrong, but each has its place. Our error, in many cases, has been extending that desire for control into all aspects of life. We develop such pride in our abilities to manipulate our world that we begin to believe that our way is the only way. This is, in my view, totally inexcusable arrogance. Not only that, but quite adolescent for us to maintain and encourage as a way of life. Yes, it is our destiny to learn and understand the workings of our world. This is the sacred principle of finding our way through our profound ignorance. But we do not have the right to completely alter life in a world that has taken literally millions of years to form. These things should only be undertaken in order for us to understand what is already here. Natural order has come to be as a result of our Creator's effort to form creation itself. This is why the natural order of things should be our guide and our law. When we utilize our free will to alter natural order, we are unleashing potential catastrophe. Life is a delicate balance of complex elements, often too complex for even the most brilliant minds of our time. This extends to all aspects of living, including technology, social structure, politics, family life, and any other facet of living. I need to use an example that will be uncomfortable for some. Sexuality takes an odd place in human behavior. Here again, we have the influence of free will. In nature, sexuality focuses almost exclusively on procreation. We don't treat it that way, not exclusively anyway. We emotionalize it. Once you open that emotional door, the dimensions become almost boundless. There's little question that emotionalized sexuality is something that's quote-unquote natural for humans, but again we can stray from a natural course. Outside of sexuality, both men and women have characteristics that are unique to each. The first American perspective is that not one is better than the other, but each are simply unique and equally important. It's been observed recently in popular culture, medicine, and psychology that while growing up, children need both the influences of the father and the mother to maintain a balance in developing their future adult skills. Even if these skills were so-called compensated from other sources, they were still needed. For a while, it was a popular notion that only one parent was necessary. Women were self-inseminating and rearing children on their own, claiming everything would be fine, but this is panning out not to be the case. Humans occupy a unique place in natural order. Our emotions and our ability to choose, not to mention our sacred journey out of profound ignorance, shape our path in ways other life forces in the universe do not experience. Some might say that this is a quote-unquote bad thing, and that it's neither something we can handle nor do we have the right. This simply cannot be. Our attributes and characteristics aren't self-determined, but gifted by our Creator. This not only prevents us from, quote, being bad, unquote, but literally teaches us that we have a sacred place in creation. Obviously, all this clouds exactly what that place is. Sexuality is symptomatic of that confusion. We're given the ability to stray from what some might call a natural course, so much so that the stray itself becomes seemingly natural. The focus on what is quote-unquote bad compared to what is quote-unquote good is the wrong one. It should not only be on what is quote-unquote right, but what is true. For human beings, sexuality is only really two things: procreation and entertainment. Both and neither are or can be expressions of love. Neither are quote-unquote necessary outside the perpetuation of the species. Love can be expressed just as passionately and just as intimately in hundreds of ways. It's our emotions that tell us it's necessary, which, in a sense, so it becomes. But where is the middle road? Where is the right road? Our native relatives had ways of finding out and dealing with these questions. Obviously, their course, out of their own profound ignorance, was to seek as natural a course as possible. Their course was into nature, not away from it, as are many cultures and societies scattered about the planet today. In the case of homosexuality in the Lakota culture, the behavior was considered, quote, heyoka, unquote, or contrary, in other words, not natural. These perceptions and other types of, quote, opposite behavior, unquote, were intercepted by specialized so-called societies within a band or tribe, as it was explained to me by a Lakota so-called teacher. In some cases, people undertook a lifetime of, quote, living opposite, unquote, walking backwards, saying hello for goodbye, or I hate you for I love you, and men wearing dresses and the like. He referred specifically to the Kettle Drum Society within the Lakota Nation, which aided people back to, quote-unquote, proper or acceptable behavior. Unfortunately, many people in contemporary society have no controls or even guidelines as to what behavior is right or true or even works. Once we employ quote-unquote choice and apply emotion, we lose a foundation of a natural course. Even the perception of what truly works can be askew. I believe it can be said that quote-unquote exploration away from what might be considered a natural course is in fact an integral part of our very nature. But you can't possibly avoid the observation that we, again, go too far. If sexuality becomes the focus of love, love is lost. If outrageous sexual behavior becomes normalized, normal, or more accurately, natural intent, is also lost. The farther we stray from our Creator's intent, the closer we get to doom. Free will and natural law, the conflict. One extremely glaring difference between the way first Americans and many other cultures of the world handled the exclusively human trait of free will was that they chose not to succumb to it in the extreme. Instead, they nurtured it and saw that it was a great and dangerous gift. Many cultures, European, Oriental, Middle Eastern, and even some South American, chose to utilize their free will to expand and quote-unquote pervert natural order. As in the natural world, the principle of, quote, the survival of the fittest, unquote, became the accepted course to the point where the resources acquired through free will were used against those without access. Power, similar to the power a lion might have as the greatest carnivore in an environment, was expanded and transferred to a small segment of the population beyond any concept of normalcy. In nearly every instance of the transfer and control of this power through the control of resources and by force of will, nearly every so-called civilization it created has destroyed itself, all as a result of this extremely unnatural imbalance. This is true right through history up to and including the fall of the Soviet Union. It simply doesn't work. It contradicts human nature and thoroughly contradicts the purpose of free will. In the natural order from which human beings have been set apart by this great gift, it is natural for there to be an alpha male. It is natural for there to be a pecking order as with chickens, the original source of the phrase. It is natural for there to be a food chain, where there is a natural progression of food production and consumption. Human beings have been ripped away from these systems by the acquisition of free will. This is why we must observe natural law, and, as our first Americans were, very careful in how we participate in it. Left to our own devices, our arrogance and the sense of superiority our gift of free will gives us, our gift can and does destroy rather than nurture and create. I'll give you an example. There is a great controversy over the issue of hunting. Both sides happen to be right. What is missing is a common bond of purpose. We should maintain our roots as hunters and keep a proper perspective with our origins in nature. Also, we should take great care in what and how much we hunt. It can be a useful tool to correct the imbalances we have created as a result of our expansion into natural systems. But our arrogance and our, quote, complex, unquote, of superiority can be severely deviant from anything that resembles natural order. Our conflict with this issue lies in the extremists that do not have a natural perspective. Between the unsophisticated barbarians that continue to kill simply for the enjoyment of it, based on the simple ability to do it, and the, quote, bleeding hearts, unquote, that do not believe that anything should ever be killed. What it all boils down to is the fact that many of us don't have the slightest clue about how to handle the great and sacred gift of free will. Later on, I will discuss what I feel might be creation's great purpose in giving us this gift. For the moment, it might be best to stick to the simple fact that we have it and try to understand what it is. Fundamentally, first Americans feared this powerful thing and spent a great deal of effort trying to harness and understand it within themselves. Ancient ways as a constant reminder. Some of you might say, okay, we understand the principles, why bother with the ritual? One very fundamental thing I learned about this way is the fact that it is, quote, deeply rooted, unquote. That means it is constantly reminding you of the basics of living. We need this. None of us is so brilliant, so together, that we can let the fundamentals become passé. No matter how far we develop, no matter how sophisticated we become, we are always human. This requires that we constantly remind ourselves of our faults and weaknesses, of the fact that the complexity, diversity, and immensity of the universe will always be immeasurably overpowering to us. Centuries from now, when many of the mysteries of the physical world become common knowledge, we will still need our roots in our humanity. Our first Americans' philosophies and spirituality helps hold us to that humbleness. I believe that without that kind of grounding, humanity will float off into oblivion. End of Part 4.